So you're thinking about interesting and important puzzles relating to society and institutions, and you're doing this research. You're developing ideas that are genuine ideas you really believe in, that are worth sharing with people who matter. You go to Silicon Valley and you're able to pretty quickly start having conversations with people who matter and people who are interested in your ideas. How does that go? How does that then become more formal relationships, whether it be in the form of, and I don't know too much about your operation, so you can feel free to divulge or keep private, whatever you prefer. But how does that then materialize into, whether it be, I don't know if it's patronage relationships, maybe donor or grant relationships, or also kind of hired research relationships, putting you in the form of essentially a kind of private researcher for hire. How does having ideas and developing personal relationships with people interested in those ideas, give us a sense of how that materializes into kind of financially sustainable operations, however you think about those operations?
Right. Well, fundamentally, I built my business in order to run a successful research program, including for the analysts that work at Bismarck. The priority often there is kind of intellectual growth, accumulation of this type of human capital, basically research progress if it can be achieved. But of course, it's also a for-profit entity. So there is a question of, well, is there research that is close enough to applicable to be something that might be profitable for clients, or at least of supreme interest to them? So I would vaguely classify these two big buckets of stuff. One, research that is on specific organizations, institutions, where the correct answer is useful enough for their ongoing efforts, their ongoing strategy. In that case, you actually have to know quite a bit about the client. On the other hand, is something that you could consider philanthropy, but I almost it's almost like fundamental intellectual curiosity, like things that just in an ideological sense to the person in question, they would want to hear answers, they would want to understand. You can get all sorts of interesting research funded. You can get research funded on, the distant history of mankind, when exactly civilization arose, the question of in which conditions this political violence arose, which kind of straddles the border between, this kind of like large intellectual curiosity and something very practical, right? Obviously, you need to think about, how stable is a country? How stable are the conditions in a country? You might be especially targeted if you stand out in some way. So I was saying, you might get anything funded from, research into, the distant history of mankind, research into what are the bottlenecks on technological research in the modern era, which Western governments are perhaps the most flexible and are the likeliest to undertake serious reform, or, stuff that's oriented towards questions of nuclear war or global pandemics, or any of that other stuff that starts becoming more conventionally philanthropic over time. And, a lot of these people, they're very alive, especially if they are in a self-made in some sense. Like if they created their own fortunes, which in Silicon Valley is often the case. Very intelligent, passionate about questions, and often they're just really short on time. They're really short on people. So these are kind of the two big buckets. One of them requires you to know a little bit more about the person. The other one requires you to know a little bit more about the world, and also make a differential case that you in particular are the correct person to solve this intellectual puzzle, or at least to contribute to it substantially. I can give some more examples besides just Bismarck. There's this whole movement called the effective altruist movement that arguably sponsors some intellectual work. There are people interested in artificial intelligence. Like the Silicon Valley ecosystem, in fact, sponsors a whole number of such things. There's also, say, a magazine called Palladium Magazine that presumably has donor backing and ends up researching some of these questions related to political science. So I feel like right now we're at the cusp of Silicon Valley developing a good nonprofit culture, but I don't think it's there yet. So I actually think it is an uphill battle, right? Each of these examples that I listed is a little bit weird. So in my experience, the for-profit side has actually been a bit easier, right? unless a nonprofit sector is developed in a new center of wealth, such as, say, New York was a new center of wealth 100 years ago. That's why the great foundations are all based in New York, because the industrial fortunes were made there and the nonprofit sector was built there. But unless a nonprofit sector is developed, you're going to have a very hard time getting compensation that allows you to live in one of these hubs. But if you can't live in one of these hubs, how can you get the social capital to fund these things? Well, you don't. So it's a little bit of a catch-22. This is why on the East Coast of the United States, very often a nonprofit job is something that you get into if you're already well off. So having said all of this, for-profit is easier. It's something better understood. People, however, have a really hard time pricing intellectual services of various kinds because they have difficulty evaluating where ideas come from, what has been decisive, what has not been decisive, especially if you're working for a larger corporation of some kind. My experiences have been that you never want to deliver a report to a committee. You want to deliver it to an individual. If you deliver a report to a committee, you have to agree with all of them, even if they disagree with each other. And if you deliver it to an individual, you might even be able to disagree with the individual. And that, for intellectual integrity, is unskippable, right? So what I'm saying is not all money is equally good if your goal is intellectual production, because some money will require you to compromise intellectual integrity.
Absolutely. So that's very fascinating. You're giving me a lot of interesting thoughts, like especially if cryptocurrency becomes a new center of wealth, as it appears to be, is the cryptocurrency community going to be creating its own nonprofit structures to fund disinterested intellectual work, perhaps? I'm not necessarily putting that question to you, just an example of the possibilities what you're saying might be pointing to. So I can kind of put that to the side for a minute. One thing that you were saying that really struck me was it almost sounded like do you go and pitch people on paid research grants? Do you go up to someone and say, hey, I think your business really needs to know more about X. I have a thesis. I'm pretty sure this is what's going on. Would you pay me X amount of dollars to work on this for the next 6 months? Is that what you do? Exactly.
That is exactly what I do. It is the most straightforward way to do this. And honestly, the interesting part is that it works. It's one of the advantages of being in a relatively underdeveloped market. There is, again, in the financial world, there is some interest in what they call political risk consulting, has this deep analysis of politics and sometimes social trends, but it's usually done in-house. The interesting part about these pitches is that, if a person doesn't go for your pitch, as long as they found other value in all the conversations you had, and as long as you're not gauche about it, I think, the relationship is often preserved. And then years later, opportunities might arise that previously didn't. So you have to be patient. You kind of mustn't be pushy also, right? You mustn't feel like a salesman. That's not what you should feel like. You're talking to them about the fundamental nature of the world, and then you happen to identify good opportunities.
That's fascinating. And I appreciate the concrete information there. It's because I think a lot of people, it's hard to imagine how this works in detail. So that's absolutely fascinating. Now, if you don't mind, maybe for my audience, give us a little bit of a sense of your day to day. I mean, are you in the weeds of running a consultancy business, or are you writing full time, or where on that spectrum? Like, is it half of your day is dedicated to slow, patient, peaceful reading and writing, and the other half is dedicated to business operations? Or is it, how does it look? How does that trade-off look for you in practice right now?
Yeah. Basically, half of my day, whether I like it or not, is eaten up at this point by just internal management of my organization. I think this is something that I underestimated 8 years ago, 10 years ago. It's something that I've needed to get better at. It was a new skill set that I had to learn. It was one thing to, go and talk to interesting people. It was one thing to get insights. It was quite another to be in a position where you are evaluating the quality of intellectual work, not just for its truth value, but for the legibility to a client that you now know very well. So that quality control function is there. It's a challenge. Another challenge is just, human relationships. What is a professional relationship is a very interesting question that I think people don't tend to dig into too deeply. They just tend to go with a default thing, an off-the-shelf thing. But when you're creating a new company, sometimes there isn't an off-the-shelf pattern, right? I work with people who are trained philosophers, who worked in finance, who worked in technology, who are lawyers. There's no unified company culture. I just had to make it. So there were years when I was almost more focused on the company side than the intellectual side. And on the other side, on the other end of it, there were years where I was almost exclusively focused on the intellectual side. So I feel I did benefit from a lot of like intellectual capital built up in my early 20s. But the day-to-day question, I have days that are reserved exclusively for reading, days that are reserved exclusively for writing, and days that are reserved exclusively for essentially intellectual discussions. I think smart people are the best nootropic, right? Smart people are the best nootropic. If you can afford the leisure of it, in the sense of the Roman concept of otium, right? The concept of leisure that improves you, set aside a day and have 6 back-to-back conversations with the smartest people you know. I guarantee you're going to be full of new, seemingly unrelated ideas a few days later. And I think the best explanation I have for this is that it just does stimulate your brain that much. And especially if you take detailed notes, it's by far the best possible education. It's the best way to hit the cutting edge of research. One of the things I also do that seems perhaps less useful to my business, but I think is just vital to my intellectual project, is reaching out to top intellectuals of various kinds and just talking to them, right? That's something that takes up some of my time as well. And I feel it's unskippable.
Is this just an email? Are you asking to jump on a call with people? How do you think about that difficulty of wanting to connect with smart people for probably mutual gain, not just out of self-interest, but not wanting to bother people, not wanting to waste their time, that sort of difficulty? How do you think that through?
Well, again, the difficulty is having something worth saying. So there should be at least one intellectual question where they can contribute and you can contribute. And you better be quite sure about it. You better be quite sure that you have something unique to offer, something novel, right, that you've thought through, some fundamental problem. And yeah, you do cold emails. Sometimes you perhaps, if you're running a show, Justin, you're pretty well positioned. But for example, I got to talk to Slavoj Žižek because I was contacted to interview Slavoj Žižek. So we ended up having calls before that interview and after that interview. And that's why I got to pick his brain about politics. And, he enjoyed it too. There are introductions that people can make for you, right? So as soon as you talk to a few smart people or a few elite people, suddenly you can talk to all of them. At least if you didn't make a terrible impression, if you were what you promised to be, it seems the world is very small and everyone knows each other, right? And then, yeah, I think a call is irreplaceable. I think emails can be valuable, but unless you have a call or an in-person conversation, you're never going to pick up the intellectual dark matter of that person. You might know or to ask something that's typical to ask for their field. But if you wanted to figure out what their ideology is, how they think, how their neurons fire, I'm sure you've had the experience of just looking at someone's face and feeling like you kind of understand how they think now. After all their tics seem to be a little bit different, the cadence of speech is a little bit different. There's something that's really hard to put into words that I think is picked up in face to face.